Hi, welcome to session one of the ninth topic of the semester titled The Counterculture Revolution and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s. Okay, so this is the ninth topic. This is the last topic of the semester, by the way, and we're ending this class by looking at American history now in a very in-depth way and looking at really one of the last reform movements, one of the last popular reform movements in U.S. history that really transformed American culture and society in very significant ways to the point that today we're still living under the institutions and the policies that were implemented back in the 50s and 60s. And again, many of those policies and ideas and institutions that we live under today emanated, they were created from the what is called the counterculture revolution of the 1950s and 60s. There was a movement to really reform American culture, but not necessarily by implementing policies, but rather that the culture of the United States, there were millions of Americans that were actually stepping out of the mainstream, so to speak. They were questioning some of the main principles or tenets of the American way of life, of the American cultural values. Again, they were questioning, and in many cases, they were rejecting them as well. And they were searching for meaning. They were searching for a source of identity elsewhere in other cultures. You know, Americans are beginning to look into the outside and borrow elements from other societies, from other cultures, other religions or spiritual paths, etc., became more appealing to the United States for millions of Americans, of course, and that produced what is called a counterculture revolution, which really kind of initiated a new cultural era in the United States in which Americans are now trying to borrow ideas, borrow traditions from other societies, from other civilizations in order to make up their own. So we're beginning again at American culture becoming more diverse, more culturally diverse. That is to say, in that Americans are not really going to follow strictly all of the ideas of the past, going back to the founders, for example, going back to the previous generations. All of the main ideas of the past are going to be questioned in a very significant way. And we're going to explain why, again, why that actually was happening. So we're going to cover that, and also we're going to cover the civil rights movement as well of the 1960s. This is, again, a movement, a reform movement in which different groups in the United States were trying to reform the institutions. So people that were not properly represented in the state, represented in the economy and the political system, gained that particular, equal representation. So we're going to cover exactly what the civil rights movement was, what were some of the groups that were trying to gain equal representation in the United States, like, for example, have real representation in the voting process, for example, the right to vote, equal pay for men and women, doing the same job, etc. And again, we're going to look at some of those groups with minorities. In this case, we're going to look at those minorities and see the background of those minorities and how they're going to actually create this last popular reform movement in the United States called the civil rights movement. Some of the legislation also that was implemented for those minorities to also gain rights, civil rights, and to be included in the political process and also be included in the economy as well, so they can gain employment, etc. Yeah, it's very important. Again, so let's go to our slide. So we can now see the title. Again, this is the title, The Counterculture Revolution and Civil Rights Movement. And again, the period of time that we're going to be looking at is between 1950 and 1973. In other words, if we really want to see, all the years that encompassed both of those phenomenons, the counterculture revolution and the civil rights movement, we'll see by looking backwards is that those two phenomenons that were kind of arising simultaneously. Okay, the counterculture revolution, people going against the culture of the United States and incorporating new ideas, was kind of coinciding with also the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, they're very interconnected, despite that one is really, again, a cultural phenomenon. The counterculture revolution was like a cultural revolution again, and the civil rights movement was more political. It seems to be that has a political, orientation. There were certain political goals that civil rights activists sought to accomplish. Despite the fact that one is cultural and the other one is political, they were very intertwined in that one of the reasons that we're going to see the emergence of a civil rights movement, this political reform movement, was because there was a revolution of ideas, again, that people were informed by. Okay, that generation of the 50s and 60s really experienced an ideological revolution in which there were new ideas in society that were circulating around. People were now reading new philosophies. They were reading the histories of other societies from around the world. We're going to explain why, in which particular philosophies, again, Americans were exposed. And that really changed the way people perceive the world around them. So again, because there was a revolution of ideas in this counterculture revolution, again, it's a cultural revolution. New perceptions, new meanings were on the rise. That really inspired, again, millions of Americans to create political change. So first, there was a cultural uprising, a cultural revolution of ideas that is going to actually alter the way people thought, for example, about politics. And they're going to go out into the world, organize, and try to create a better society, a more democratic society in which there will be equal representation of all people, of all citizens before the law. Okay, equal representation before the law. Okay, and of course, equal treatment, equal access to jobs, equal access to resources, the right to vote, and so on. This is what Americans, again, were going through in the 20th century. Again, it's very, very important popular reform movement. That was the last one that we have had in U.S. history. So that's why I have placed this topic last, just to examine how this is going to shape today's world. You'll be able to understand our world even today much, much better by looking again at the counterculture revolution, the civil rights movement. Now, the table of contents is quite simple. In part one, we're going to look at the counterculture revolution first, that span between the 50s and 60s. Of course, there's going to be a special organization. I'm going to discuss that in a few moments as to how we're going to actually break it down. In other words, how are we going to look at this cultural? It's actually a cultural revolution, but this cultural revolution was going against the mainstream culture of the United States. That's why it's called counterculture revolution. So we're going to look at that first. We're going to do that particularly in this session. And if there's anything pending, we're going to continue looking at that in the second session. But in part two, once we take a look at the counterculture revolution, then we're going to look into the civil rights movement that spans between 1955 and the last piece of legislation of the civil rights era was in 1973. That was the last again. So it is assume that the civil rights movement, really the most intense period, was in the 1960s. It's true, but the early rise of the civil rights movement was back in 1955, and again, it's going to continue all the way to the last piece of legislation to 1973. Okay, so this is the table of contents, which, by the way, those are going to be the key terms, for the final exam. Okay, the counterculture revolution and the civil rights movement. All right. So let's look at part one, the counterculture revolution, okay, of the 50s and 60s. It's an extremely fascinating subject matter because when we examine history, the traditional approach of looking at history is to look at uh, economic, political factors, political history, economic history, which is very, very important to look at again. But that is what is called institutional history, looking at the institutions, for example. Okay, what the government is doing, political parties, elections, laws, etc., all of that. What the economy, again, is also going through, if there's a recession, if there's a depression, if there's a boom, etc. All of that is very, very important as well. But a culture, again, cultural history, is also extremely important. This is not just something that must be understood as secondary, but rather has to be understood as fundamental, again, for understanding history. What really shapes human societies. Okay. There are political and economic forces shaping human societies. We have seen that um, in this class, okay, quite a bit. But if you, for example, look at the very first topic, now we opened up the semester by looking at the rise of modern America. Okay, the ideas of modernity, for example, it was really a cultural analysis of how after the Civil War, okay, we're going to see the rise of a new society, a new culture in the United States, which is called modern culture, by the way. We looked at all the ideas of modernity, again, looking at, for example, the rise of modern science, modern technology, the modern economic system like capitalism. We were looking at that quite extensively. The ideas of individualism, private property, and the like, free enterprise. We had to understand that because that's how the United States was moving into. There was a new culture on the rise. Okay, there was a new way of looking at the world that most Americans were informed by. Again, so we looked at those cultural ideas. We kind of started with a cultural analysis of what was the United States culture like in the late 19th century. It was, creating a whole new culture called modern culture. Okay. There were certain values, again, attached with it, like the values, for example, of economic success. As again, Americans were very much driven by success and so on. And this is, again, something that most Americans were pursuing. Individualism, that Americans saw themselves as individuals in the world trying to attain success through their work, through their own effort and merit. Again, and that was the goal of life. Again, success. So we had to do that, first, kind of understanding the culture of the United States, because everything else that we covered ever since, all the topics, were kind of building on top of that. Okay. The transformation of the United States as a modern industrial society, the rise of the second industrial revolution, new industries, the modernization of the South, the modernization of the West, and so on. Americans moving outward, searching for new frontiers, moving into places like Latin America, for example, precisely to spread modernity around the world. So we were just building on top of that again, the new culture of the United States. Okay, so this topic is going to look, at the counterculture revolution, meaning that Americans living in the 1950s and 60s are going to question the ideas of modernity in a very significant way. Okay. And they're going to propose new ways of actually looking at the meaning of human existence that are going to be contrasting sharply with the ways of the past, of this modern way of looking at life, of progress and economic success and individualism, and all of that will be questioned. So that's why this is very important, because from the 50s and 60s, we're going to see the rise of a whole new culture in the United States. Okay, that is not really following necessarily the principles of the past, okay, the cultural ideas of the past. So the way we're going to look at this is first and foremost by looking at the theoretical and historical background of of this counterculture revolution. In other words, okay, so why is it that Americans were going against, in other words, the mainstream American culture? Okay, like capitalism, for example, individualism, and so on. So can we explain that? In other words, it's not just enough to look back and say this happened, in other words, but rather we need theory, and theory is one way that we explain why things happen in history. Okay, why there are counterculture revolutions, for example. What was really going on around this time that made Americans question, the main tenets of American culture? Okay, so we're going to look at some theory. In other words, there has to be some explanation as to why, this was going on. And of course, the causes, the historical causes as well. So a little bit of theory as well as with some historical background, what led to this counterculture revolution. And once we understand that, then we're going to examine then the most important cultural phenomenon, again, of the 1950s and 60s. In other words, that there will be a counterculture revolution. This is really a new culture of, if you will, a new way of looking at reality, at looking at society, at looking at human existence. And in the 50s and 60s, this revolution was known as the existential movement. The existential movement. In other words, that there were millions of Americans that were embracing a whole new way of looking at life, a new worldview. Okay, it's called the existential philosophy, the existential movement. Okay, and it really, shaped the way people are going to look at life in general, how they're going to look at the meaning of human existence, the purpose, for humans to be on Earth, to be alive. What is a human being, for example? All of those things are going to be on the table. People are going to be pondering on that. And people are using those ideas to reinterpret the way they see society. In other words, you're going to look around, at our society, American society, and they're beginning to question, many of the most accepted norms that back in this time, Americans found so normal. The existentialists are going to question pretty much everything. Okay, so again, we're going to look at that existential movement, okay, quite extensively. So again, it's going to be very interesting because we're going to actually be talking about culture now in this particular first part, looking at the counterculture revolution. Okay, so let's look at then part one, looking at the theoretical and historical background of the counterculture revolution. Okay, so in order to understand why we're going to see this cultural uprising, so to speak, and it's cultural. Remember, when we talk about uprising, we tend to think about people rising up and there's violence and so on. No, what I mean about a cultural uprising is that there's going to be an upsurge, if you will, in society about an upsurge of new ideas that are going to revolutionize, the way people think. Okay, is more than a simple intellectual revolution. It's more philosophical. It's deeper, that is to say. Okay, the way people are going to start not only thinking about the world, but also the way they want to experience the world. Again, that is, is deeper. That's when we talk about philosophy, for example, because we have to move now into the world of experience. How do we experience life in the world? Okay, it's not just how we think about the world, but how we experience it. Okay, so again, we're going to take a dive now into the minds of Americans living in this time, what they were thinking about, and what kind of experiences they were seeking. They were really pursuing, deeper meaning, deeper experiences, because the experiences that were common during this time that most Americans had were not very fulfilling for them. Okay, they were not finding fulfillment, in American culture. What most Americans were experiencing on their daily lives was not very meaningful for them. Okay, so they were looking for specific experiences. We're going to actually talk about that. Okay, so in this part one, we're going to first understand the theory and the background, in other words. Okay, so why is it that there was a cultural, revolution going on here? Okay, and to understand that, well, we need a little bit of cultural theory. That is to say, the theory of cultural revolutions. Scholars that really look at culture, cultural phenomena, cultural change, and so on, what they call cultural studies. Again, there's a field in academia called cultural studies. It's fascinating, by the way. It's cultural studies. It really, again, is built upon certain theories that explain why there are cultural revolutions in human history. Okay, there has been many cultural revolutions, in many parts of the world. For example, in Europe, back in the 14 and 1500s, there was the Renaissance. The Renaissance. There was a cultural revolution. Europeans were rediscovering their Greek roots. They have rediscovered that European civilization went back. The mother culture of Europe was, the ancient Greeks, and they were bringing the Greeks back, and Greek art, Greek philosophy, Greek science, etc. Again, they were rediscovering the Greeks. They call it the Renaissance, the rebirth. It dominated European, society for 2 centuries. The Renaissance. That was a cultural revolution. So there's been several, again, all over the world, and so. The 1950s and 60s, again, likewise, we're going to see a cultural revolution taking place all over the planet. Okay, so this is not really confined to the United States. This is very important. We have to understand that this cultural revolution was worldwide. Okay, it was global. Okay, it was actually global, by the way. Okay, but it had a unique expression in the United States. Okay, a unique expression. Every country was going through this, but every country was managing it or carrying it out in very different ways. Okay? But nonetheless, there's a cultural change, a deep cultural change taking place during this time. Okay, so the theory of why this is happening, the theory of cultural revolutions is that usually when we see a cultural revolution occurring in history is due to intense and radical change taking place in society. Okay, so whenever there's intense and radical change, and there's so many different types of changes, by the way, this is when human beings now go through those kinds of cultural revolutions. They either change their culture very dramatically and very drastically, not overnight, because remember, for example, the Renaissance was a two centuries again worth of a phenomenon that actually spans for 2 centuries. But indeed, the way people are beginning to frame the way they look at the world is going to be altered in a very dramatic way. Okay, and that is because of intense radical change taking place in their society. So what kind of radical change, what kind of intense radical change Americans were experiencing back during the 50s and 60s that led to the counterculture revolution? Okay, so those changes were changes that they experienced in the 20th century, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. Okay, there were radical changes taking place in the 20th century that this generation, that generation of the 50s and 60s, were pretty much in the middle of that. They were in the midst, again, of a transition stage in which the world that surrounded them was totally new. There were new innovations. There were new ways of doing work. There was new ways of enjoying life, etc., that were so radically different from the ways of the past. So this is something that was like a cultural shock, so to speak, for many people, because again, the world was changing. The 20th century, undeniably, again, this is a century of drastic, radical change in many, many areas of life. The people that actually inhabited the 20th century, particularly in the early part or the middle part of the 20th century, were seeing a totally new world arising, that again, so it was very shocking for a lot of them. And so therefore, because they experienced life changing very radically, they're going to question many of the norms, many of the values of society, and they're going to pretty much go against it, and they wanted to really recreate the world in a different way. They wanted to bring about a new culture, because when they looked around, it was just, again, they were dissatisfied in many cases in the ways, they were dissatisfied by the ways that society was moving. Okay, the way society was moving was not really providing meaning and fulfillment to their lives. So what exactly, again, are we talking about here? What kind of radical changes occurred in the early 20th century? Well, number one, and again, this is going to sound like we're kind of recapturing what we have talked so far. And it's very refreshing because as we're ending the course, it's almost like we're putting into perspective, okay, everything we have covered. This is the last topic, so it's almost like taking a glance. And so what, the main themes that we have elaborated upon that were important in shaping American history. In this section, we're talking about 1302. And so it's almost like going back and kind of recapturing, many of the elements that came together to shape American history. So this is exactly, again, what the 50s and 60s generations are actually looking around, and that was rather new, the new developments, the radical, intense change taking place, and they found this radical change taking place, very dissatisfying, not very fulfilling. For example, number one, consumerism and material culture. Undeniably, again, we talked about that when we were talking about, for example, the Great Depression. In the early decades of the 1900s, the American economy was now largely based on consumer goods and consumer goods and services. Okay, it was becoming a consumer economy, and that brought along with it, okay, a consumer culture. We talked about, again, when we're talking about the Great Depression. So American culture was now more and more identified as a consumer culture in which people were trying to find happiness, fulfillment. They were trying to communicate success to others, or they were trying to seek empowerment through the consumption of goods and services. People consume products because they wanted to be happy. They wanted to enjoy, the product and find fulfillment with it, again, or they were trying to buy expensive products in order to communicate to others that they were wealthy, that they were successful, etc., had purchasing power, and so on. Or they were trying to buy products because they were trying to empower themselves, seeing those products as a source of empowerment. So we talked about that. So what that meant is, it's called consumerism. That is to say, the idea that people are trying to find happiness through consumption. That's what consumerism is, that is to say. Okay. What that actually brought is that American culture was becoming more and more materially based, in other words, material culture, in which Americans saw themselves as material creatures. Our physical bodies are simply physical organisms that they work, they function as a machine, for example, and that the way this physical organism, again, finds fulfillment in the world is through matter. That through matter, through the sensations of this material existence, this material world, through those sensations, okay, that we, by gratifying our senses, it's called sense gratification, that by gratifying our senses, our physical senses, that pleasure that we feel from those sensations, that actually makes us happy. In other words, that pleasure is happiness. In other words, that is, again, the kind of underlying idea of consumerism. Because we're physical beings, therefore happiness must be, material based. In other words, that we can obtain material well-being, material happiness by coming into contact with matter. That is to say, that some material objects or elements, etc., are very pleasurable to us when we come into contact with them, etc. So in the form of products, etc. It doesn't matter. Okay. So again, we're now moving into a material culture. Okay, in the early 20th century, undeniably. In the 1910s, 1920s, then you got the Great Depression, by the way. But after the Great Depression of the 1930s, and when we move into the 1940s and 50s, the same process unfolds, is that Americans are trying to find fulfillment, happiness through consumption. Okay? And so, again, this is a radical change, intense radical change, because this is something new. And look at the past, and you look at the 19th century, 18th century, in the past. This is not to say that people were not trying to find some form of fulfillment, again, through consumption. But for the most part, it's just that there was not a lot of products, again, around. Were not industries that were generating massive amounts of products in which people found themselves surrounded, again, in a consumer paradise, that this is how we live heaven on earth, because there's just so many options, so many different products that our industries are creating. That was something new of the 20th century. Okay. So in the past, when people purchased, anything, when we look at the 19th, 18th, 17th century, we look backwards, when people purchase anything, it's because they needed the product. Okay. You needed shoes. Well, you buy shoes. Okay. You might buy certain types of shoes. It's true, but people had like this practical, orientation whenever they were buying, something. It's because they need it. Okay. They needed a piece of tool to carry out certain work. They needed clothing and so on. And they needed food. It was essential. So people were more practical in the past than in the 20th century, because now when people go out to the market and buy something, it's not because they actually need it. It's because they're trying to find happiness, in other words. That's why people are buying it. So this is first and foremost, again, that this is becoming the mainstream, and this is how people behave. This is the norm. This is normal. In other words, that you see millions of people trying to attain happiness through consumption. Okay, so this is intense radical change. Okay, and the other, of course, is another intense radical change of the early 20th century is the technological revolution. Okay, undeniably, the 20th century was the century of technology. This is not to say that the 21st century that we live in today is not. It is, but we're just like an extension of the 20th century, because many of the technologies that we have today were innovated back in the 20th century, and we're just simply building upon them, trying to get them better. So the 21st century is the continuation of the 20th in technology-wise. Okay, so this is something that back in this generation, people experienced, that there were new technologies, new tools that were surrounded by machines. Okay, all of the new machinery that came from this technological revolution. that really goes back, back to the 19th century, but it's really in the 20th century. We're going to see now, a totally new world, a high-tech industrial civilization, a high-tech, in other words, a high-tech world. We're moving towards a new world, in other words, the world of technology, radical change, technologies that have never existed in the past, by the way, okay? Never. They were new. Okay, that's called modern technology, new machines. And those machines, what they were doing is that it is true, they were assisting human beings in the production of products and goods and so on. Even the production of crops, everything that people produce that needs to be produced and more is produced by machinery. But what that was doing is that the machinery of this technological revolution was mechanizing not only production, in other words, that all production is mechanized because there's a machine that is actually producing it, but it's also mechanizing society as well. Okay, mechanizing society. That society was also becoming quite mechanical. Okay, in that the way we organize ourselves is that we have to for example, follow the clock, be governed. Our time is going to be governed or managed by a mechanical device. We call that the clock. The way we frame time, for example, is mechanically. It's no longer by looking at nature, at sunrise or sunset, and looking at the movements of the sun and the moon, etc. It's not natural rhythm. It's more like a machine, a mechanical clock that is telling us what time it is, when we have to go to work. We have to wake up at a certain time, be there, punch in, at the factory or at the, at work, at the office, etc. And all our working time is, and even our free time is going to be managed by this machine. Again, we call the clock. And we work inside of factories. We work inside of industries that are also surrounded by machines as well. Okay. And so society is being mechanized as well. So this is the sense that maybe we're merging into machines. We're first governed by machines. We operate machines. We're surrounded by machines. But aren't we at some point going to merge with those machines? Our human beings will become like robots, or are humans going to be replaced by machines to do the work? Instead of somebody doing work and being hired for that work, that maybe there's going to be a robot or a machine doing it, in other words. So that generated anxiety. There is a certain concern or anxiety that the machines were taking over. In other words, they're going to take over, our society. So this is something that was new as well. It was different. It was radically different. And that is going to, create, again, the sense that, well, if this is the mainstream culture, we're moving into this new way of doing things, is mechanically, well, there's going to be a rejection of that. We're going to see, of course, there's going to be a questioning and also a rejection of that mechanization, if you will. Okay. Now, the other, of course, extension of the technological revolution is that what is new, by the way, in the early 20th century is modern communication systems. Modern communication systems were really changing the way people actually communicated. They're communicating instantaneously now, regardless of how far apart they are. That distance is not going to be a limitation, like the way it was in the past, that whenever you wanted to communicate, you have to write a letter, and the letter will take months to get to the destination. So information moved very, very slow, because the systems of communication were not really, again, sophisticated. But what we're going to see is, with this technological revolution, is modern communication systems like the telegraph, the telephone, radio coming out into being in the early 20th century. The telegraph and the telephone came in the latter part of the 19th century. But the radio, the television are coming now to the forefront in society. in the early 20th century. Okay, now you can actually see images, of people that are so far away from you. You can hear them, you can see them, and so on. So this is new. So we're so accustomed to this technology that we just don't see how this actually change people's lives, because we're born already into it, okay, into this new reality. We take it for granted. In other words, and as a matter of fact, I should say, um, we just cannot imagine life without a screen, without a television or a computer. It would be like it would be a revolution, not to have it, because we will have to reinvent ourselves. We will have to provide new meanings as to what actually are we doing here, because we spend so much time in front of a computer or television. We get our news or information from them that without we will have to reframe, culture in a whole different way. So in the same fashion that we'll have to reframe a new civilization without this technology, this generation of the early 20th century had to reframe a new reality when suddenly they had this technology being presented to them for the first time. So it's new. So therefore, because it was new, people had to find meaning. What does it mean? Now to have modern communication systems, to have radios, to be listening to an individual talk to me, from afar, broadcasting messages, whether they're commercial messages or political, doesn't matter. That's going to alter the way people are going to think. Of course, information alters the thought process. Okay. And images, likewise, in televisions alters the thought process, but also emotions. Television strikes at people's emotions. You can cry after seeing an image, for example. Okay, you can get angry as well. Okay, if we feel emotions and the like. Okay, so this is not just to say, okay, so they were invented. So what? You have to go back and see how people, witnessed, interpreted, metabolized that experience. In other words, okay. I think it will be the equivalent of, seeing for the first time, let's say, anti-gravity aircraft today. Never seen actually that, but imagine if suddenly you'll see, an object floating in midair. It will be like magic, for example, okay? And we will have to reframe everything we know. Everything that we thought we knew will have to be questioned, okay? And that provides an opportunity to people actually create, a new worldview, a new culture, again, a whole new culture, a new lens for how to see the world, in other words. Um, like a new chip, you have to get the old chip back and pretty much put a new one, with new information. Okay. So another aspect of this technological revolution is modern transportation systems. Okay. So it's not just communication, but also people moving at greater and greater speed. With not only the railroad was part of the 19th century, by the way. That was the revolution of the 19th century, transportation revolution. But in the 20th century, we saw, for example, the automobile. Okay, in the early years of the 1900s, the automobile industry, the Model T, and so on. Highway systems on the rise, paved roads and interstate, highways and the like are on the rise, and also the airplane as well. Okay, so again, the ability for people to travel and move around is going to increase manifold. Okay, to the point, just like information is traveling more and more, instantaneously, because that's what the information age is. Information traveling instantaneously. We're now moving around the planet, rather fast. You take an airplane, for example, in the United States, in 24 hours or a little bit more than that, you'll get to the other end of the world. You can go to India, or you can go to China, Japan, etc. Again, whereas in the past it took many months again. So to do, because you have to travel and ship. So this is extremely important, because this is really leading to what we're going to actually talk about just in a few moments, what we call globalization. Okay, globalization. The early 20th century, people are now gaining now more and more the sense that we're living in a global community. Okay, that is a growing sensation. By the way, this is not to say that people immediately develop that perception, but with increasing communication, as the world is becoming more and more interconnected with systems of information, and also moving around the planet rather fast, with modern systems of transportation. We're now seeing the world, really shrinking more and more. That we're not really, seeing ourselves separated from one another, even though we are in time and space. We are separated. There's different continents and so on. Yes, it's true, but the sensation that we share the same planet, with that we're part of the same species, that we are a community again. This is a sensation that is beginning now to take root. In other words, the first seeds are planted here. Okay. And not only that, but, the technological revolution of the early 20th century, particularly as we move in the 1950s and 60s, in that generation, particularly the late 1950s and the 1960s again, they witnessed the dawn of what is called the space age, the dawn of the space age. Okay? There's, of course, missions to the moon, for example. There are satellites and space exploration taking place. So this is something new as well. Okay, totally new, that our technology was now moving outward as well. Okay, and from afar we can see the globe as well. From outer space we can see that we all share the same planet. Again, we live in the same planet. So we are indeed a community. Again, this is something that gradually, is taking place. That our technology is advancing so fast that this traveling that I just mentioned, this transportation systems, is now moving ourselves outward in outer space as well. But perhaps this is the first baby step, if you will, in this direction. But that's our future. Maybe our future are in the stars, in other words. One day we'll be able to explore the solar system and so on again. So this is intense radical change. In the past, it was unimaginable. If anybody imagined traveling outer space, it was considered really, again, not sci-fi. It was just considered to be, fantasy. Okay. For us, it's science fiction now to be talking about the future of humanity moving outward and other planets, interacting with other species. It's called sci-fi, in other words. Scientific fiction, but nonetheless, there's scientific fiction is not necessarily fantasy. Okay? It's just that it's science, but it's something that is not necessarily yet a reality. But science says that can happen. Okay? It's just fictional. Again, this is something new, the space age as well. Okay, this is extremely fascinating. That this generation of the mid 20th century is just, again, experiencing something new, it's totally and radically new. By the way, okay. And the third, of course, phenomenon, or the third intense radical change, something I just mentioned a moment ago. Again. Besides, of course, the consumerism, for example, this material culture that I just explained, that is on the rise, is becoming mainstream. The technological revolution I just explained as well, that it was intense, radically new as well, is that by the 1950s and 60s, by that time already, the generation of this time are now witnessing the dawn of a new age, and that is the age of globalization. Okay, the age of globalization, and that was very, very visible. And if you just want to be very, very practical, about it, is because the fact that there was far more interaction taking place between the United States and the rest of the world. That was something that was very practical to see. In other words, that look, there's more international relations taking place. There is international trade, taking place. There's now, of course, trade taking place around the world, nations trade with one another. The United States, of course, becoming more and more involved again in places like Europe and so on. We talked about like the Cold War, for example. So the Cold War was extremely important for, fostering the sense that we were no longer an island again that was isolated in this world, that the United States was not really totally cut off or isolated, in which Americans, had no experiences or no contact, no interactions with the outside. The Cold War actually gave the sense that there was increasing interactions between the United States, that there was a growing interconnectedness, if you will, between this country and the rest of the world, that we're interconnected. Okay, and to a certain extent, we're interdependent as well. That no country can truly be totally 100% totally independent from the rest of the world, because we need trade. Things that we lack, must be traded, for other countries that have those, and we perhaps are going to, generate products or ideas or technologies that other countries don't have. So there's trade, in other words. So yes, so in terms of just the Cold War, if you want to be practical, that really produced among people the sense that we're becoming far more integrated, in the world, called globalization. So globalization again is just simply the idea that all of the continents, all of the civilizations of the world are totally interconnected somehow, whether the interconnectedness is strictly economic in terms of commercial exchange, but also that there is increasing communication between the peoples of the world, that we're not totally cut off, but rather that besides that we trade, material products, we exchange commercial goods, that we also, of course, trade information and ideas. Okay, we influence one another. Okay, that the cultures, the ideas that are, essential or fundamental in one culture are not restricted or confined to that culture, to that region, but rather find expression all over the world. Okay, so we have more exposure, in other words, to other ways of life, other ways of doing things, other traditions, and so on, that the cultures of the world are kind of coming together because there's now communication systems, there's transportation systems that allow people to share knowledge, to share ideas, and we borrow from one another. So we're becoming like a global community that over time, down the line, maybe in a few centuries or perhaps a couple of thousand years, we're going to be moving into what is called a global culture, that all of the cultures of the world are going to kind of coalesce, merge, and kind of become a single culture, something that will take a long time again. But this process in the 20th century, many people felt had begun. The process of actually the world coming together and beginning to pretty much borrow ideas from one another, and that there was a lot of borrowing and sharing, going on around the world. Now you can see on TV, for example, documentaries, from societies, from other cultures. You can see their traditions, you can see their rituals, you can see the news, again, of what is going on in Europe. You have an immediate, experience of what other societies go through, and so on. So it's almost like you're part of it, even though you're not. But again, that we're sharing experiences because of technology. We're sharing ideas. We're sharing experiences. So we become like a global community. In other words, that's globalization. So again, this is something that has been going on, by the way. If you really want to be very, very specific and technical as to when globalization actually began, historians that look at globalization globalization studies, they indicate that the 20th century was not really the beginning of this process of the world cultures and civilizations coming together. Okay, that this has been a historical process that has unfolded for at least 7 or 8 centuries, going back to the 12 and 1300s with the rise of international trade. So you say, okay, so if the world is becoming a globalized community because of commercial exchange, international trade, well, the 1200s, the late 1200s and the 1300s was the beginning stages of international trade. You know, when Europeans are stepping out of Europe to go to places like the Middle East, they're going to Asia, to India for silks, for spices, for teas, and so on. And the world is beginning to become more and more interconnected commercially. Europeans went to Africa as well. They discovered America and they colonized America. And of course, after that, again, this process of colonization gave rise also to more and more international trade, commercial exchange between the different continents of the world and so on. Again, so it has been a historical process, globalization. This is not something new arising in the 20th century, but because of technology, okay, because of radio, because of television, and because of the Cold War, if you mix all of that all together, the experience for this generation in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, was that this is now a reality. Okay, globalization, the sense that you're part of a global community, was becoming more and more a reality. The encounters of the world cultures and civilization was now happening almost instantaneously when you listen to the radio, when you watch a TV program or news, and so on. And of course, there's a lot of books being written, by the way, okay? Travelers that go to Egypt to study the pyramids, for example. There's American also scholars that go to Central America to study the ancient Mayas and so on. They write their travels, their memoirs, their ideas, and there's the publication of books that talk about other cultures, okay? In the United States, we're going to see in academia a lot of scholars writing books about different civilizations. They travel to different places like India or Egypt or Africa. There's a number of scholars going to Africa, American scholars, to study the ways of life, the cultures of Africa, and they write books that present to society, African cultures and traditions. So there's more exposure, if you will, to the outside world. And now students in universities are now reading books or taking classes or seminars that actually talk about, of course, other societies, the way people live in Australia, for example, the Aborigines in Australia and so on, okay? Or in Latin America, okay? Maybe Native American groups in Latin America and so on. So more and more people are gaining a worldview that encompasses all of the peoples of the world, that they're stepping outside of their very localized, cultures, that their culture, what they know, what is American culture, they understand that this way of life, which is American culture, is just one of many, okay? One of many ways of doing things, one of many ways of thinking, in other words. And again, that opens up, people's minds and are able to think about diversity. In other words, look, there's a multiplicity of different cultures around the world. There's multiplicity of many languages, many religions as well. Okay. And again, so there's going to, be an interest in the United States to learn more about other societies, what other societies are like, for example, okay? People want to study, for example, Eastern religions, what in the East, people pray to, what kind of gods do they pray to, what kind of religions are there? So like Hinduism, for example, Buddhism, and so on. So there's going to be an intense effort, really, to learn from the outside, precisely because the world is becoming more and more globalized. This is something that, of course, we today are experiencing even to this very day, and even more so because we have internet, because we have iPads, cell phones, and so on that enable us to connect and communicate with the rest of the world. So we can see images instantaneously of an event that happened on the other side of the world. It goes viral, so to speak. Okay, you saw what happened in Africa or whatever. Okay, so again, communication is now allowing people to develop a globalized worldview. In other words, a view of the world that is global. That is to say, the emergence of a global consciousness, global identity. Okay, and so that's radically new. Okay, for the people living in the mid 20th century, radically and extremely new, by the way. So now that we have understood that, now let us look at the historical background uh, of the counterculture revolution. So far, we looked at the theoretical background. In other words, okay, so what is the theory for this cultural revolution of the 50s and 60s? And of course, when people go through intense radical change, usually they reframe everything they know. They reframe their basic concepts of life, their main ideas about the world, what is the meaning of human existence, and they give rise to new cultural expressions, new cultures. And we already explained, what exactly radically and intensely new, they experience, materialism, consumerism, a technological revolution, of course, globalization. So now let's look at the historical background now to look at, okay, so how exactly are we going to see in the 1950s the rise of this counterculture revolution? Okay, what particular historical events were going on in those decades that influence now people to start framing, okay, a new philosophy, a new culture that is going to influence the world of art, the world of politics, the world of religion, philosophy. It will have many, many implications. So this is not just going to be a philosophical, experience in which people are simply just thinking differently, but it's going to be expressed once again in art, like in music, in paintings, for example, is going to influence, of course, politics. There'll be, the rise of certain groups that were coming together to try to really create a new identity for themselves. And of course, philosophy and religion, there will be new religions, if you will, on the rise during this time, all of which combined were moving against the mainstream culture of the United States, the counterculture. Okay, so this generation of the 50s and 60s is a generation that today we know as the baby boomers. Okay, this is the baby boomer generation. Why are they called the baby boomers? Well, they're called the baby boomers because in this generation, uh, we're talking about particularly 1946 to 1959. This is the year 1946 after the end of World War II. So it's almost like back to back. When the soldiers came back and the Second World War comes to an end, there was in the United States, and I should say around the world, so this is not uniquely American, the baby boomers was part of a larger process uh, uh, around the world. The Europeans also went through that in Latin America as well, all over the world. We see now the rate of the generation again between 1946 46 and 1959, we're going to see a population increase. The birth rates again skyrocketed, in which in that 14 or 13-year period, or thereabouts, 15-year period, what we're going to see is that there were about 15 million, okay, human beings that were born, in which, again, it has never, been this way, in that we have an increase so fast that in only like about 15-year period or so, there's going to be a 30% population increase, okay, because the birth rates just went to the roofs again. So this was something of a phenomenon again. So this is not to say that in the past population did not really grow that much. They did, but here it was a phenomenon. Even the birth rates were just, again, skyrocketing. That's why they called them baby boomers. There was a baby boom, in other words, taking place during this time, and they're going to become the generation of the 50s and 60s that will create this counterculture and civil rights movement both together. Okay, so 30% population increase in the U.S. alone, and part of the reason why, again, this is a sociological analysis as to, okay, so what is the reason why we got baby boom, of course, is that during this time, because the United States moving to this wartime production, from World War II, that ended the Great Depression. Suddenly, the economy recovered, in a very significant way. There was massive unemployment. In fact, there was a shortage, of labor. We saw that, that even, the United States had to sign, the Bracero program with Mexico, allow for Mexican labor to come, farm labor to come into the United States, and so on. So it was a scarcity of labor, by the way. So it's massive, again, increase in production and jobs and so on. The economy recovered. And so because now Americans were doing very well economically, there was affluence now. Again, there were families were pretty much enjoying the prosperity of this recovery and so on, and coupled with, improvements in health science. For example, one of the major improvements, there were a couple of them, is the polio vaccine. That was actually developed by Dr. John Salk. He innovated the polio vaccine. That was really one of the main causes for infant death rates, infant mortality, in other words, that children died very, very young because of polio. And so now that we have this polio vaccine, that is going to allow now children to grow into adults, into adulthood, in other words, to make it, in other words. Okay, so there's the lifespan is going to increase as a result of the polio vaccine, and also the penicillin, vaccine as well. Penicillin for treating infections, bacterial infections. There was another, again, issue that led to a lot of deaths in the past. So because there were major improvements in medical science, in health science, now coupled with this affluence, again, this new economy that was booming. So there's a booming economy coupled with, major medical improvements. We're going to see, of course, more and more babies not only being born, but also making it into adulthood, in other words. Now, the baby boomers. Okay. Now, that is, of course, leading to the background. This is just setting the stage, in other words, why there's going to be a baby boom generation. And this baby boomer generation are going to be the ones that are going to question the culture, create a philosophical, cultural revolution, and, of course, engage in the civil rights as well, and the civil rights movement. So the ways to understand the baby boomers and why they're going to create so much commotion in society, this is the last popular reform movement, again, in U.S. history. So to understand what motivated them, what inspired them to be engaged in the world, to question the culture, change it, or trying to reform the society, the political institutions, and so on, the civil rights, we have to understand that the baby boomers really were coming into the world from families, their parents were actually the generation that experienced the Great Depression. So again, we have to understand that again, when we see human societies are developing based on generations. In other words, every 20 years or so, there's a new generation, so to speak. Okay, which is changing, today a little bit. But back then, it was so common to see that every 20 years we got a new generation again, in a new generation. But the baby boomer generation were really born from the Great Depression generation. Okay. And so the significance of this is that the generation of the Great Depression, okay, were so still very much concerned with economic matters because they lived through the trauma of the great crash of 1929 and the whole decade of stagnation, unemployment, and forming lines to get a meal and so on, all of that. Scarcity, in other words, they experienced life in terms of scarcity in a very deep way. That they were still carrying on that trauma, so to speak, that economic trauma. Okay, so for them, economic well-being was the most important issue of life. The Great Depression generation, again, the parents of the baby boomers, were so oriented towards actually making it in the world. In other words, what you need to do is make sure you're going to have a sound and stable economic, well-being. Okay, that you're going to be well off. In other words, that you make sure that you go to school, you study, you work very hard, you save money because you never know, and buy a house, and just make sure that you're going to succeed in the world economically. That is to say, because they were still traumatized about the Great Depression, so they didn't want their children to be unprepared. They didn't want their children not to be disciplined, not to end up in a low paying job, etc. They wanted them to succeed as much as possible. Okay, more than all the previous generations. This generation, of parents were the most concerned, the most worried about the economy than all the previous generations. Okay. It's part of the trauma, the generational trauma. And so what that meant is that if you're a baby boomer back during this time, you were pretty much hammered by your parents that you need to go to school, and you need to succeed in life, you need to get, study certain careers, certain majors. Other majors are not important. What you need to do is study something that will make you, successful in the world, something that will you're going to make money from, in other words, okay, that you're going to be well off. So that's what you need to do. Okay, there's certain professions that are very valuable, medicine, law, or business, for the most part, that you need to do that, in other words. Okay, so because everything that matters is that the economy. Okay, that is the most important value that this baby boomer generation received. So what that actually did, okay, is that that the baby boomer generation felt that they were pretty much initiated into a materialist culture, that the culture of the parents was materialistic, and that the parents wanted them to simply follow that path, that this is how you attain happiness. You need to be well off because you have to avoid poverty. If you're poor, you're going to suffer. Okay, you have to avoid poverty at all costs. You need to work very hard, save money, be well off, move in the suburbs, and have a good paying job, etc. That's the ideal existence. Okay, that's what you need to strive for, and so on. So what the baby boomers are simply, witnessing is that, so I'm actually just, concerned by making money. In other words, that's all I need. And, enjoy myself with consumer products, consumerism. Okay. That's all I need to do. So they looked around, and as they're growing up, they felt that that was not a very fulfilling life. In other words, that they had other needs, other desires, other ideas that contrasted with their parents' ideas about life, what we're supposed to do, as human beings in this world. Their parents were saying, what you need to do is succeed economically. That's all that matters. You're going to be happy with that, in other words. But they found that path of material well-being, material comforts, material happiness, that was not really the purpose of human existence. That's now how human beings find fulfillment, in other words. That's important, to have certain comforts, certain certain needs being met, material needs like food and clothing, a house, etc. But that's not the end of it. Okay, that's definitely not the end. So instead, they're going to actually question. They're going to question again this materialist culture, and they're going to reject, this culture as a whole. They're going to reject this material, modern, industrial culture that is geared towards materialism, is very mechanically oriented, mechanically based, and mechanically organized as well. And that it's just see human beings as physical organisms that are trying to find fulfillment from physical sensations, in other words. And that's the end of it. Okay, you got, you live, you go to school, you work all your life, you're well off in this house, and that's the end of it. Okay, you succeed. And so you say, well, is that really success? Doesn't sound like it. Okay, so the baby boomers, of course, because they're more exposed to the ideas of other societies, they're exposed to other philosophies, other religions, because of globalization, because of modern systems of communication, because there's books, that are published by academics or by other authors, etc., by philosophers and so on. They're getting exposed to other ways of doing things, other ways of experiencing life. They're not going to find their materialistic culture very fulfilling, but instead they're going to actually look around and find fulfillment, find more meaning in other ideas, again, that they read about, that they were taught, etc., in other circles and so on. They're going to have friends, or they're going to go to certain meetings or conferences and so on, gatherings, and they're going to, now undergo what is called an intellectual, philosophical revolution, that they're going to now move away from American culture and instead really, moving to other cultures. They're going to borrow again the cultural values of other societies, of other civilizations, particularly civilizations that are ancient, ancient civilizations as well. Okay, so they're going to question the values of economic and financial well-being. Now that those were not important, so it's not. This is not to say that, okay, look, what we need to do is just being poor. In other words, embrace poverty and so on and so forth. So it's not about that. It's just that the values of economic and financial well-beings that are centered in consumerism, materialism, rationalism, and social status. Again, those are the values of the culture of the time. This is the values they received from their parents, from the Great Depression parents. Okay, they receive those values from their teachers as well. When they go to school, for example, you're taught that this is, again, the meaning of life here. Okay, we're supposed to work very hard, study, and then have a good paying job. Okay, because we need to enjoy ourselves, be happy through consumerism, for example. Okay, this is the meaning of life. There's a lot of products out there in the economy, in malls, in stores, that are going to make you happy. Okay? Materialism, again, that this world is material. This is what science is telling you. when you go to school, this is what the science teacher, what the science instructor is actually telling you, that we are just in a material reality. And that's all there is to it, materialism. And that in order to actually understand the world of matter, that we need to use our rational mind. We need to be rational, in other words. We need to understand the laws of nature, rational analysis, using mathematics and so on, physics, to understand this world, be rational. In other words, there's going to be an overemphasis in the rational mind, in other words, okay? And that in the end, that we need to strive to improve our social status, okay? That in the end, that we need to actually end up in a good paying job so we can actually acquire a good, social status, middle class, upper middle class, and beyond. That is the meaning, again, of life. So again, this generation, the baby boomer generation, even though they're learning those ideas from their parents and teachers and instructors, they're not going to be content with it. Consumerism, materialism, rationalism, and social status. That is the mainstream culture. What they're going to do is they're going to go against this culture, against the mainstream culture of consumerism, materialism, rationalism, and social status. And they're going to now give rise to a new culture, okay? A new culture. This new culture is going to be, today, we simply know them as to be postmodern, okay? The postmodernity, in other words. So the baby boomers were rejecting the values of modernity. They said, okay, so this is modernity, right? Okay, economic, financial well-being, and everything that comes with it. This is our modern culture, right? Yes, well, we reject it, and we're hereby initiating, something quite new, something that will go beyond modernity. So we're initiating something called post-modernity. So what is really post-modernity? Again, if you really want to find out, and I think we arrived already to the end, again, of our first session, but just to give you a sort of synthesis here as to what is postmodernity. Postmodernity is simply a philosophical movement, a cultural movement that rejected, first and foremost, modernity. It's totally questioning, the idea of materialism, consumerism, rationalism, and social status, first and foremost. But beyond that, because it's going beyond that, postmodernity is really a philosophical movement that informs people that human existence goes beyond the realm of matter. In other words, the realm of matter. That this world that we see here, this material world, is just one level of existence. That's just one level. It might be pretty much the lowest level that we can experience, as human beings. And that human beings, that there's more to the human being than this physical organism. Okay? That there's a part of us that is not really material, that is more real, as a matter of fact, than our physical bodies, that is to say. What we call the self, for example, the self, the part of us that is, real, that is experiencing this world, that is not really material, that is to say. And that happiness is not necessarily, found in consumption. Okay, the physical sensations, again, of the products that are around in the market, for example, that are sold to us, that those physical sensations that we feel from the consumerism, in other words, that's not the source of happiness. That the human being has the capacity to experience life in a more deeper, more fuller way that does not really require contact with matter, that is to say. For example, inspiration. You can be inspired, by a lofty thought, for example, that will take your being into another realm that is totally more expanded, far more expanded than this physical world, for example. Okay, or what about, for example, things like love, for example, or compassion, that will be far more fulfilling, okay, than simply consumption, for example. Now, I'm not saying that this is a spiritual, actually, movement, post-modernity, but it's trying to move beyond, again, modernity altogether. And it's also trying to move beyond the rational mind. This idea of trying to rationalize everything, trying to understand everything intellectually, that there's a part of us that is actually beyond the mind. Might want to call it a soul, okay? Might, okay? It's not necessary to really call it a soul, but you can, if you're oriented towards there's a part of us that actually understands the world not through the rational mind, okay, but through this level of being that might be, of course, something deeper, like the soul, for example, soul experiences, mystical experiences, for example. You can actually experience and understand the world like that. And that social status for postmodernity is not really determines who you are. That human beings are not defined by the kind of status that you have, like lower class or working class or middle class and upper class. Okay, that's really an artificial identity. Okay, it's really an artificial way of looking at yourself, by social status, because your being, yourself, is not really material. So whatever, identity you have based on matter is just an illusion. In other words, I'm a member of this upper class, etc. You're not material. Okay, so you're identifying with matter. So there's the lowest level of existence, by the way. So that's not really a real identity. So social status is not very important. It's the quality, again, of life you have, the quality of experiences. If you're truly happy from within, not to find happiness outside of yourself. Are you really happy even though you're not consuming, for example? Okay. Are you really peaceful inside? Or do you need to be peaceful or happy with something outside of yourself? So postmodernity is really moving away again now, this generation, away from the principles or the ideas of the past. This is slowly but surely. Again, we're gonna get there. So when we come back, we're now going to look at part two, looking at the existential movement that was part of this post-modernity, in other words, that we're now going to see a philosophical movement on the rise that is going to be really the cultural expression of the baby boomer generation that was going against the mainstream culture. It's called the existentialist movement. We're going to get into the main ideas as to what was really going on again during this time that really influenced the way people are going to think about human existence, what kind of ideas are going to be important for the generation, and how those ideas are going to find expression in the world of art, in the world of music, in the world of philosophy, religion, and politics. Everything again in session two when we come back. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session two when we come back. Thank you.